I'm going to talk about a range of things over the next hour and a bit, but I will say you may perhaps in a moment in a fitful moment, you may want to write down some element of what I'm talking about. So let me just say in advance, I do plan to share all of my slides, and of course I'm releasing them under an open license. I would be a hideous advocate for open education if I somehow, created some sense of false scarcity around this knowledge. I'm also mindful, I feel like today's quite fascinating as a day, and I don't know if this is, I hope it's a good thing, because what we're talking about in some ways is ideological shifts within the academy, culture shifts within our practice, on a day where weather patterns and perhaps politics are shifting just the same. But I do want to recognize, beyond today being election day, of course, and I know yesterday was the day that Manitoba recognized the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and of course we do this a little bit differently in different provinces, but I do want to start by acknowledging I work on the traditional ancestral territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples in the Niagara region. I live, as odd as this is, on the traditional territory, unceded territory of the Squamish Nation in British Columbia, and I do want to recognize both of those territories. But more to the point, I do want to say that I honor the wisdom, the teachings, the languages, and the traditions of the ancestors who've lived on this land since time immemorial. As a first-generation immigrant and as a settler, I certainly reflect deeply on the history of this land and my relationship with it, including, of course, the violence that has historically and that continues to be perpetrated against Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. I'll tell you that my own personal journey of reconciliation has involved a lot of learning, but also unlearning and relearning. Part of that has been realizing that my home in British Columbia is about 10 minutes away from the site of a former residential school. If you drive by it today, you'll see a sign, St. Thomas Aquinas Secondary School. But if you go into the school, you would have no sense of its history. It's quite deliberately hidden, as I'm getting security messages on my computer, quite appropriately. But even if you go to the website of the school, it's quite fascinating. There's a long history, and it skips the entire period where it was a residential school, right? And that's not unusual. That's quite typical of how we think about this time and why reconciliation is the challenge that it is. And I'm sharing all of this because that journey that I've had to undertake has been assisted in many ways by friends, by colleagues, by students who are Indigenous, of course. And as I'm talking, I want to remind us as well, here we go, of the words of the Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair, who is chair, of course, of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He said, education got us into this mess, and education will get us out of it, of course. And so I would remind us that we have a moral obligation over here to respond effectively, tangibly, not performatively, and not cosmetically, to the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'm saying that in particular because one thing higher education is exceptionally good at is performative allyship. Right? I think we all know this. And beyond this, I also want to talk about how we need to follow through on actions committed to in the Scarborough Charter on anti-Black racism and Black inclusion in Canadian higher education. Very proud and glad to see that the University of Manitoba is among the 50 or so signatories to this important document. And also want to talk about how we need to work towards an in-depth and intersectional understanding of inequity, discrimination, and exclusion as called for in the Dimensions Charter. These three documents, I'm going to put them side by side. If you're unfamiliar with them, please let studying these maybe be the most important takeaway from today's conversation. Because for me, this is sort of at the heart of the role that education plays in society, right? And without this work, without this intention, all we're really doing, quite frankly, is participating in, reinforcing, upholding a system that seeks to replicate and reinforce existing societal hierarchies. Many of us are here for different reasons, of course. And so I want to remind us of these. On that non-light note, I'll start by sharing this comment. This is a thought from one of my favorite educators, philosophers, the late great Bell Hooks, who wrote about how her commitment to engaged pedagogy was an expression of political activism. Right? And so I quite agree with this, of course, and particularly as an academic administrator, I don't think I should be in this role unless I'm really, really clear about what I'm trying to achieve politically, culturally, and otherwise. And so let me be very transparent about some of my politics over here. I came to Canada as an international student. One of the things I experienced along the way was food insecurity. I remember that time. I served as an adjunct faculty member at one point, working at 3 different institutions on the same day, trying to cobble together a full-time job without benefits. I remember that time. I know what exclusion, marginalization in the academy feels like. I also know how rare it is still to have academic administrators, let alone senior academic administrators, from the dark side actually have little melatonin. Sorry. They have a lot of melatonin, not melanin. And I'm saying this because, this again, as I said, strikes to the heart of what I'm trying to achieve over here. And so as a person of color within academic administration, within the academy, I will say my job, as I see it, is to very much talk about how we can reshape what we're trying to do. Right? For me, this notion that education is a vehicle that can serve economic and social mobility, that it's a tool with which we can unlock human potential, it's not a theoretical concept for me. It's a very, very much my lived experience. And so I will say one of my joys moving into roles like this at Brock is to actually have an opportunity to start to craft the system and tweak things in a way that actually tries to effect some change. So I talked about my values. You'll see it in Brock's academic plan. Right? And of course, I can't just force this on the institution. This happens with a million conversations at a billion Senate committees. But this is the will of the university at this point, right? So I wouldn't have expected this 10 years ago. So if Brock is saying, well, we're going to develop resources and supports for educators grounded in anti-racist, trauma-informed pedagogies that sustain inclusive and harassment-free learning environments, that's good. Develop and adopt an ethical framework for educational technologies that ensures the procurement of digital tools do not perpetuate, do not reinforce systemic inequalities and racial biases. Now you're understanding why Brock is not, right? We're not going to adopt remote proctoring software. We're not going to permit the use of AI detection tools that are biased against non-native speakers of English. This is intentional. Right? Embedding Scarborough Charter principles, of course, all 4 of them into academic planning, developing a Black Studies program, and this is 4 out of 44 goals in academic plan. Identifying and working to dismantle systemic academic barriers experienced by BIPOC, disabled, 2SLGBTQ+, and gender diverse faculty, staff, and students, and on and on and on. Now, of course, as you might imagine, because of my work and because of the nature of why I was brought into Brock, there's a whole separate goal having to do with open education, which we will talk about. But what I'm trying to suggest is this is a moment where I'm seeing a lot of this kind of conversation within the academy, not just in terms of name changes of institutions, but real substantive change. Right? But I think from an academic administrator's perspective, I will also say sometimes there are politics one has to navigate. You have to think about when you're going to sacrifice your political capital. And I certainly wouldn't hesitate to do it for the right reasons. Right? But this is achievable. And I think you're on a path, if I'm looking at your strategic planning documents, that show me that you're on a similar journey. I've been studying that journey. Here's some brief excerpts from your Where We Are Today Revisited update having to do with U of M's institutional strategic planning, right? A clear sense that access to education was foundational, okay? This is a lot of community feedback over here. We want a stronger commitment to inclusion, increasing participation in post-secondary education by underrepresented groups, much more work to be done for UM to be a truly inclusive community. Absolutely, right? But you've got the bones. What I would say is harness this, right? Take this momentum. As an administrator, I want my Senate to hold me accountable for delivering on some of those goals over the next few years, right? It's a powerful force, right? The system has certainly been weaponized against people for whom it has not been designed, but we can use those same processes to reshape the system. As we used to say at my former institution on the West Coast, where I worked for 25 years before moving to Brock last year, if you design for the margins, everybody benefits, right? So no more of this retrofitting individual accommodations based on the compassion of individual educators. No, proactive, inclusive design, right? And this, of course, happens in a number of ways. This is true when we're talking about legacy admissions, which is a lovely way to uphold the status quo, by the way. It could be about high textbook costs, which we'll talk about. It could be about the design of learning experiences that students are neither working nor have parental responsibilities. These are all of the subtle ways in which we are designing the system to say, we want to reinforce the status quo. We want to make it difficult for first-generation students without access to the hidden curriculum to attend. We want to make it difficult if you're a working professional for you to upskill and come to university, for example. And this is also especially true when it comes to teaching and learning in digital spaces, right? So let's talk about digital spaces for a moment, because algorithms are certainly not apolitical. Safia Noble writes in her book, Algorithms of Oppression, that search is a symbiotic process that both informs and is informed in part by users. Right? And yet, if the majority rules in search engine results, then how might those who are in the minority ever be able to influence or control the way in which they are represented in a search engine? Consider, for example, the results that show up in Google when you search for unprofessional hairstyles for work. I'm going to leave that up for a few seconds. And now compare these with the results that show up when you Google professional hairstyles for work. This is revealing. Okay, let's not do Google search. Let's start another product. How about Google Translate, right? So if you paste text into Google Translate from Finnish to English, right? I'll just pause. Finnish is a language that has only one pronoun for the third person, regardless of gender. But when you translate it in Google Translate, it translates it into English in a way that isn't just gendered, but also quite sexist, right? He is a journalist. He is a leader. She is exhausted. She has a grandchild. She has a headache. She's taking care of the child. See what I mean? Yes, very much. And of course, none of this is an accident, right? Just as the development of racist soap dispensers that do not recognize the hands of black people waving their hands below the soap dispensers, that happens a lot. It's because of who is involved in the design process. It's involved in terms of who was at the table, how was this constructed. This is not a far reflection, by the way, of how the academy was constructed. It's not necessarily malevolence. It's just, if you're not at the table when decisions are being made that are ableist, those decisions get made, right? And people with disabilities are not often at those tables. So, as we say, in higher education, we can talk about how digital textbook platforms that do not include proper accessibility tools, this is a thing in the academy. Certainly it was through the remote emergency instruction period of the pandemic. This is how we end up with learning management system integration that defaults to legal names, and so it constantly dead names our trans students. This is a thing, right? And this is, of course, how we end up with remote exam proctoring software that has algorithms that disproportionately flag students with darker skin tones as cheating. This is all part of the landscape of digital teaching and learning today. In her book, Race After Technology, Ruha Benjamin refers to this as the new Jim Code, not Crow, Jim Code, the employment of new technologies that reflect and reproduce existing inequities, but that are promoted as more objective or progressive than the discriminatory systems of a previous era. And so, as has been noted many times, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. So take a look on this note at the recent case of generative AI. Some of you may be familiar with Midjourney as an example of a generative AI product that puts out images instead. So a few months ago, somebody asked it to generate images of professors across different disciplines. You can guess where this is going to go. Take a look. Wait for it. It's coming. Hey! Yes, ethnic studies. We got ethnic studies. Oh, it's depressing. All right. But also, let me just say, is it wrong, really? I mean, at the same time, there's a reason why the professoriate is so white, right? I mean, there's many second-generation scholars in the academy today. So let's talk about design justice, right? And this is an important book if you're unfamiliar with Sasha Constanza-Schock's work over here. She describes design justice, as you can see, as a framework for analysis of how design distributes the benefits and burdens between various groups of people. So design justice focuses explicitly in the ways in which design reproduces or challenges the matrix of domination. This matters in a number of ways, right? Because when we talk about our systems, technologies, committees, People often talk about this in terms of the potential. But as I said again, if people are not at the table, it's hard. And we can talk about the difference between, in some cases, whether we invite people to the table and they don't feel welcome. Sometimes it's not enough to pull up a chair, right? And I'm sort of paraphrasing Shirley Chisholm, the first African-American elected to US Congress over here. Sometimes it's better to actually build your own table, quite frankly. Some tables are just a little too toxic. And so I want to come back to this because as a faculty member and now as an administrator, I spend a lot of time thinking about the system that was not designed to support my success, coming as an international student, the things I wasn't told, or as an adjunct faculty member, certainly, or as a person of color today. But I do think about the ways in which it bluntly, but also subtly, reinforces privilege, right? And so this is my fear. We talk about the promise and the potential of higher ed, but this is often the reality. So I'm going to remind you of some interesting things. I don't think many people realize that Article 26 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights actually speaks to the importance of equal access to higher education, right? But despite this promise, which we love talking about, there's a reality. And this reality, certainly in this country, we've witnessed it in various ways. Gradual defunding of higher education across the provinces. And I don't think Manitoba, with the exception of a slight adjustment last year, which is certainly not enough to make up for many years of less than reasonable funding, is an exception. Certainly Ontario has been the case as well. How many years of tuition freeze, government grant freeze are we talking about? And the burden increasing being placed upon individual students in terms of tuition in provinces where that is even permissible, for example. So yes, now college education is more of an individual good rather than a collective good, as Tressie McMillan Cotton writes. So instead of being a universal human right, it has become an individual privilege. And so one extreme, I think, indicator of this is the shift, is the growing problem of food insecurity on our campuses. I'm just going to touch on this a little bit. This is something that we've been seeing right across the country, but of course you should know this is happening at the U of M as well. You have, of course, your food bank over here, which continues to be, the demand for it continues to outstrip, its ability to resource that demand. And it's not just about food, it's even about personal items, for example, that they constantly need. So yes, this is the case over here as well. But I'm touching on food insecurity because it connects to the conversation we're going to have about resources. Right? As individual educators, we don't have individual control over things like government funding, tuition levels, for example, fee structures. But there's one portion that we have full control over. It's course material costs. Right? There's actually nobody else who gets to make that call, which is fantastic. Right? So this is something that obviously we talk a lot about. But I also think this is one of the reasons why faculty members across the country will experience the same typical course. At the start of the semester, you get those emails. Hey, prof, do I really need the book? Hey, prof, may I use an older edition? Right? This is like standard emails leading up to the start of the semester. And one of the things lurking behind those emails is food insecurity. Right? I'm going to sort of sidestep the usual old rhetoric around, well, if they can afford beer, they can afford textbooks. Yeah, we'll talk about that. The cost of commercial textbooks has risen by over 1,000% since 1977. That's typically been between 3 and 4 times the rate of inflation. The only real plateau has come in the last 3 or 4 years, in fact, for a variety of reasons that we can talk about. But it is far, far different than it was when many of us were undergraduate students, for example. Now, of course, commercial textbook publishers are full aware of this. Many of you will recognize the business model of a new edition of an introductory textbook, a survey course textbook that's published every 2 years with fairly cosmetic changes, right? And that's because they only make money the first time it's sold, not every time it's resold subsequently. And so let me quote directly from the recent CEO of Cengage, because sometimes, amazingly, they're so privileged they don't realize that they say things out loud. Michael Hansen, who said that there are millions of students out there who are making very painful trade-offs in the purchase of learning materials relative to paying the rent, relative to paying for basic needs, food, etc. We as an industry have chosen for a long time to basically ignore that, or have more or less been paying lip service to them. Yeah, we know. It's fascinating that he said it out loud, though. Anyway. But there's many other things, right? I do want to recognize, if you're an economist, you can talk about the principal agent problem, how when you make a decision yourself that many people are are beholden to effectively, but you don't face the consequences of that decision, sometimes that has effects. One of those effects is a good chunk of faculty members have actually no idea what the cost is of the resources they're assigning. It's not necessarily information they have at their fingertips, right? And so I will quote from a student at my former institution who said, buying a $200 textbook does not hurt quite as much as buying a $200 textbook that proves to be useless. This is true. So here's some research that we ran in BC. This was a survey that went across 23 BC institutions. I want to point out that this was just before the pandemic, a couple of years before the pandemic, in fact. And so things have changed since then, absolutely. But at that point, a little over 50% were going through their courses with at least one of their courses not buying the required textbook because of cost. That's how that sentence ended in the survey. 30% earning a poor grade. That's often the calculus of the undergraduate degree, right? It's not the textbook, it's maybe the access code to some quizzing platform. That's a part of your grade. So, well, if 10% of your grade is coming from the textbook, maybe you'll take the hit on your grade. But if it's 30%, maybe you'll take the next option. You'll drop the course. And so, yes, around a quarter of students were either taking fewer courses or dropping courses because of textbook costs. Let's come to the U of M. You have some data from 2021 from a survey over here, right? 20% of undergraduate students over here who opted to voluntarily withdraw or avoid enrolling in a course because of textbook costs. So you have a snapshot of a similar trend over here. 86% who bought a book that was required only to end up using less than 10% of it. Yeah, that's painful. And of course, you can get a sense of what they were spending back in 2021. But of course, the pandemic made things much more challenging for students, certainly in terms of affordability, shrinking employment, suddenly you need to buy all this tech at the same time. So of course, there has been a shift. So across the country, we have seen quite a dramatic acceleration in the adoption and the embrace of open educational resources over the last few years. I will say sometimes it was for fascinating reasons. At my former institution, we had so many international students at the time who couldn't come to Canada for those months, for example, taking courses online. It's not like we could ship them expensive textbooks to go to China. It's not that students in China could access the digital textbooks from the publishers because of the firewall that wouldn't permit certain platforms to be accessed. So it was, oddly enough, the use of OER ended up as a bit of a risk mitigation strategy for us, completely accidental, but it worked and it took off even more. But here's a sense of how awareness when it comes to faculty awareness about OER has been changing over the years. And when I say OER, I'm talking about open educational resources. Some of us in this room, I recognize some of you have been working with me, alongside me for many, many years in this space. And many more faculty members are aware of the existence of open educational resources now, and they're certainly used in now about a third of introductory courses across the board in North America. It's been quite a transformation. This used to be sort of a niche conversation, and now, later this year, we're going to have the Open Education Global Conference in Edmonton. And I can tell you, I'm on the board, more than 400 people are going to be attending in a month's time over there, including many colleagues from U of M. The situation has changed. And so now, about 1 in 2 faculty members in a nationally representative US survey are using OER materials. That's a dramatic shift. That's a higher market share than many major commercial publishers. And 1 in 3 are using it as a required material, not just optional, not just supplementary in some of their courses. I'm going to skip past a couple of concepts over here, but I will just point out in passing that if you're like me and many of my colleagues, over the years, you've maybe become aware of the problem of textbook unaffordability. Maybe you've had conversations with commercial textbook representatives who come to your office, promising to sponsor lunch meetings and things like that. And they'll probably say, yeah, we care about affordability. That's why we have, digital textbooks that the students don't own, they lease, digital textbooks that are problematic for accessibility because you can't copy and paste and print, digital textbooks that access disappears after 180 days. So, yes, I know you want to go to medical school and you're taking a course in anatomy and physiology, but, this is only with you for a certain amount of period of time. And I'm also going to sidestep the conversation around what the publishers euphemistically call inclusive access, which is the new approach, where they try to go to people like me and talk us into campus-wide institutional deals, where the entire campus uses the same platform, all e-textbooks for all courses, for all faculty. You can choose from the selection of titles from that publisher's platform. Students can opt out, but only if they bend over backwards and write a sworn oath in blood that they will never do it again. It's very complicated. So just know that this is part of the landscape, and certainly The phrasing of this as inclusive access is hilarious. I mean, it's sort of akin to, it reminds me of the Patriot Act, let me put it that way. It's a very clever naming. So let's talk about open education. There's many reasons why I like this, of course, and one of the reasons is that we're talking about the use of resources that are developed through public funding, that are accessible to the public. We're talking about the use of any teaching and learning resources. Could be of any format, could be images, videos, simulations, textbooks, but that are published with an open license. Now, when you publish something with an open license, it means, sure, that it's free. But the definition of something of OER doesn't center on it being free. It centers on the freedoms that go along with open licensing. So free is just a happy consequence. But the real permissions are what we call the 5 R's of open. So the rights to reuse, revise, remix, retain, and redistribute. So this means that as a faculty member, of course, you're free to reuse OER. You don't have to ask for permission. But you can revise it and remix it, right? So you don't have to tell your students, don't read chapter 4, take it out. If your discipline, psychology in my case, is still bumbling its way through a replication crisis, you don't have to wait 2 years to deal with, claims that have been really questioned, so-called canonical findings as well. You can remix resources together, embed one with another, add openly licensed videos within a textbook, interactive simulations within. You can make it your own. You can retain it forever, of course, and you can redistribute it as well. So just a quick kind of tour through what are we talking about? As I said, could be images. And I share this because if you teach art history or if you've taken a course in art history, you know how expensive those books are because of the permissions involved. And so yes, when the Rijksmuseum in the Netherlands or the Met in New York, when they openly license their masterworks, this is OER. This is in the public domain in this case. Right? I can download a 3 gigabyte size file of Vincent van Gogh's self-portrait. That's OER now. It's fantastic. You can look at TED Talks. Of course, many of us use them in various ways. TED Ed, bite-sized, glib solutions to complex problems. But many of them carry open licensing as well. Interactive simulations, as I mentioned, the University of Colorado at Boulder has a beautiful selection, the PhET simulations. Certainly I use this when I teach neurotransmission or things like this. But these are all freely, not just free, but openly licensed. You can download them, put them in your learning management system, course shell. This is all OER. You can talk about homework quizzing platforms like WebWork that's widely used by physics and maths departments across North America, including UBC, including Brock, all right? Thousands and thousands of question banks over here that you can use with your students, all openly licensed. You can talk about textbooks, and I'm going to point to the University of Minnesota's open textbook library over here. They have over 1,000 textbooks, peer-reviewed. You can see the faculty members' names, their institutional affiliation. You can sort through it. All of my books are in here as well. And then you can also look at, if you're looking not just at textbooks, I like to point people to the State University of New York's Geneseo search system, the OASIS search system. This is neat because it digs into the different OER repositories, so you don't have to sort of go one by one, and it very quickly kind of retrieves what's available in different formats as well. That's just a sample, right? Now, of course, you have several supports at the U of M. I'm just going to highlight, you have, of course, access to the shared platform when it comes to creating and adapting open textbooks. If you were interested in doing that kind of work through Campus Manitoba. We have, of course, Janice has developed the OER by discipline guide over the last couple of years, which is immensely helpful. It helps your search, not start from scratch. You've got a grant program to support those who are interested in publishing OER. You've got support from the OER lab. You can attend conferences later this year. There's 2 big ones coming up this fall. All of this is brilliant. There's many more things you could do. So earlier today, I've had a few conversations with the provost, with the deans, with the associate deans. We've got really into the weeds in the OER working group as well. But some of the things I think U of M should think about. Here's an example from Brock. There's an example from UBC, 2 of the institutions I've worked at, where OER creation is recognized for tenure and promotion. You need to do this. You are the people you're waiting for. Senate members, faculty members, advocate for this. It's not that it's required. It's that if faculty members want to exercise their academic freedom in this direction, that should be recognized. You can recognize it. You should recognize it. You will not be the first one to recognize it. So for Brock, this falls under teaching and learning innovation. For UBC, it falls under educational leadership. But you can absolutely do this. And this is one of the recommendations, changing TNP policies, that is part of the recommendations from the Senate Committee on Libraries, Subcommittee on Advancing Open Access. I promise you I've been scouring your website for weeks now. So I noted that little snapshot from 2021, which is that over 6,000 students were impacted, more than $1.1 million saved, 7 faculty members using OER, with 1 adaptation completed, 2 in progress. Fantastic, right? Now that's 2021. Things have moved on through the years. And so I want to point out as well, when I say 7 faculty members were using OER in 2021, yeah, we got one of those champions in the room right now. And so with apologies, I'm just going to shine a little bit of love. Right? This means so much. I mean, we can talk about what the impact is on students in terms of cost savings, yes, and I will share some of the data with you in terms of educational outcomes. But what does it mean when a student understands that a faculty member cares enough to have made this adjustment, anticipating that they are all not enjoying privilege? So yes, Jinli Wang and Varvara Shepelska, also from the math department, I want to recognize, both instructors who've used, adopted an open textbook, and I think Jinli, you might be adopting open pedagogy as well, which we'll talk about. But here's an example of the book we're talking about that has been adapted. Again, I can recognize this is coming from the Pressbooks platform and where this has been adopted. This is fantastic, right? So please know, this is not just something that's aspirational and somewhere else. Your own faculty members are already doing this, despite the absence of high levels of institutional support. One of the things I was trying to explain to folks earlier today is there's many things you could do that would make it so that faculty members who want to go in this direction, you feel even more supported. Don't just have to do it off the side of their desk and with the goodness of their hearts. There's a lot of structural alignment that we can do over here to make it easier. So here's an example of one research study, and I can show you a million of them because they typically say the same thing, but this is a nice one to point to. It's representative. I've done one of these studies myself in BC. It says the same thing. So typically the use of OER, the assignment of OER, improves end-of-course grades, and it decreases DFW rates for all students. DFW, if you're an administrator, you know what this is. It's the aggregate percentage of students who earn a D, who earn an F, or who withdraw from the course. So it's a very common sort of correlation of suboptimal course outcomes, basically. So typically it improves course outcomes for all students, is what you see. But the best part comes in the second sentence, right? It also improves course grades at greater rates, decreases DFW rates at greater rates for, this is US research, so it says Pell recipient students, part-time students, and populations historically underserved by higher education. So in our language, it would be students who are marginalized, economically marginalized. So Pell grants are low-income slated federal grants for US college students, for example. But this is what you see. And so for me, one of the reasons I love this work is just as more marginalized students tend to be harmed disproportionately at the hands of commercial textbook publishers, they disproportionately benefit when you adopt OER. It's a beautiful game changer. So a few lessons from one of my former institutions. When I first started working at KPU in BC, it's about 21,000 students, large public institution, multiple campuses, high proportion of first-gen students and students of color. We've grown things over the years over there, and I'm still saying we, so to the point where they have a very robust publishing infrastructure now. So you'll see dozens of titles being published every year out of KPU, all openly licensed, a wide variety of disciplines. And so when my introduction made reference to the zero textbook cost programs, we started with maybe 26 courses that were using OER. By the time I left, we had over 1,000 courses using OER. We had 8 degree programs. Oh, cool. Right? And really, you're clapping for the faculty over here because this is an individual faculty decision, one faculty member at a time, basically. Sometimes a department at a time, but still, right? So in the end, 8 full degree programs, bachelor's degree programs, zero textbook cost all the way, right? And so one of the things I'll share with you is, yes, we save students a ton of money, but here's some interesting things, and relevant for when you're having those conversations with people who like to count beans at Senate budget committees and places like that. But 34% of incoming students, when surveyed, said the zero textbook cost program was one of the primary reasons why they selected the institution. I'll give you more. We did a lot of this kind of work. Higher course enrollment, higher course persistence, greater course performance across the board in ZTC courses. It's very powerful impact, to the point where I was able to say, this is the amount of tuition revenue the institution is retaining every year as a result of this initiative, and I want 10% of that, please, to make this sustainable. Because I need to support my faculty, and I need to make this sustainable. It's easy to do, believe me. There's a few things that will change the game along the way, but let me just say, let the administrators figure out the back end. They can make your life easier. You can do things like making it transparent for students at the point of registration by embedding this in the timetable. There's a lot of things you can do, but it has an impact. It has an impact on reputation and many other things. But I do want to highlight as well, when we talk about OER, the conversation is still very much almost at the surface level. And so let me try and say this in a way that's hopefully not misunderstood. I think in some ways, the least significant benefit of using OER is highly significant cost savings for students. And that's because, drawing on the work of people like Sarah Lambert, she's a friend, she works at Deakin University in Australia. It's a very important paper in the space. She talks about different levels of social justice we can advance through using OER. So I'm just going to highlight this a touch. Most of us think about OER in terms of redistributive justice, right? So we think about reallocating resources to those who by circumstance have less. So you adopt OER, displace the cost of commercial books, great, win, right? And yes, they'll do better as well because now they have access to the book as well, great. But you can go further, right? And so think about the structural academic gatekeeping that results in the voices of privilege within our textbooks. Think about the epistemologies that are excluded from academic publishing, indigenous ways of being and knowing. Think about how you can leverage open licensing to revise and remix to actually diversify the curriculum intentionally, right? In my classrooms, it didn't make sense to have all Caucasian names in the textbook, Anglo-Saxon names. No. I want to see their lived experiences in there. You can do that. And you can go further still, because one of the things we're going to talk about now is the concept of open pedagogy, which is you want to take advantage, full advantage of the permissions of open licensing, but to actually think about not just knowledge consumption for students, but knowledge co-creation, and particularly empowering marginalized students to be able to create OER that reflects their experiences as well. So this is where we're going. A discussion about open pedagogy. And I recognize this is a somewhat foreign term, new term for many people, although once you understand what it means, you're probably going to think, many of you, that, I've been doing this a long time, I just didn't know it's called this. But open pedagogy means several things. We can think about it as an access-oriented commitment to learner-driven education. My colleague Robin DeRosa and I also define it as, both the process of building or using tools for knowledge and designing architectures that allow students to shape the public knowledge commons of which they are a part. So that's all very abstract. So let me start with something very tangible and somewhat hilarious. So here's a picture from a French book published over 100 years ago. This is actually in the public domain. So technically this image is OER. This book was depicting various scenarios for the future. And this one, hilariously, is the classroom of the future, the classroom of the year 2000. I love this, right? Because I think it's easy to giggle. But if you think about what is the ideology that's embedded within this illustration, you think about, what's the pedagogical model over here? First of all, who's the professor? Who gets to be the educator in this room? Who gets to be the student, right? There's not a lot of diversity in this room. Okay, but then the pedagogy. So there's this electronic relay system that's somehow magically delivering information into students' minds. There's no peer interaction, there's no note-taking, there's no active learning. People from the Center for Teaching and Learning are going crazy over here. And do not forget, sorry, I'm stepping out of frame over here, the graduate student teaching assistant doing the actual labor. Right? So it is hilarious, but at the same time, I think it's easier to understand what open pedagogy is in relief. So for me, this is a good illustration of what the Brazilian educator, philosopher Paulo Freire described as the banking concept of education. Right? And so he wrote about how this banking model of education turns students into containers to be filled by the teacher. The more completely she fills the receptacles, the better a teacher she is. The more meekly the receptacles permit themselves to be filled, the better students they are. Education thus becomes the act of depositing, he writes, in which the students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. This last sentence has a lot going on, so let's unpack that slowly. In the banking concept of education, knowledge is a gift bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those whom they consider to know nothing. Wow. But then, you think about how we do things today. Is it possible that as we speak, there's a 400-student class at the U of M in a large lecture theater in which the faculty member is never going to interact with the students, but instead it's going to be the teaching assistants, where they're using the awful publisher-supplied PowerPoint slides, the god-awful power-supplied question banks, the publisher-supplied quizzing platform that promises personalized learning without a human being. This is happening a lot in different ways, right? So when we talk about open pedagogy, we can talk about different aspects. We can talk about access, but agency. So let's think briefly about, and apologies, Erica. I am a fan of learning outcomes as much as the next person in my office, which is maybe not that much. But let me say, I see their purpose, backwards design, aligning your activities, your assessments, the outcomes. Of course, it makes sense. I also think there's something really hilarious about claiming to know what the journey will look like before you've met the people on the voyage, right? As though they are not going to shape that journey, for example. Thank you. I feel like I've got my crew. But you think about the small decisions we make, the learning management system. You use Brightspace, right? We do as well. You build the infrastructure, the architecture of a course carefully. At the end of the semester, when you're done, you're going to archive that, maybe you'll reuse that. You don't want to go through that effort to rebuild again, right? The one thing we wipe from the learning management system is all trace of student activity. So it's almost like we told them at the start of the journey, here are the outcomes. Who are you? Yeah, it doesn't matter. Here are the outcomes still. And at the end, we've confirmed it by saying your intellectual labor was really not adding value to the world. And so think about playing with those ideas a little bit differently over here, right? The most popular, the most common approach to open pedagogy has to do with course assignment design. And it's replacing traditional disposable assignments. I know that sounds pejorative, but the idea is in a traditional assignment, yes, it serves the student learning, skill development, but that's it. It'll probably end up in a recycling bin at some point. Right? The faculty member is the only audience. So with open pedagogy, you have a larger audience than the faculty member. Maybe public, maybe the other students in the class, maybe future generations of students taking that program. Who knows? Bigger audience. Longer life than the semester. It may live on forever. And bigger impact than student learning. So there's at least 3 dimensions that are a bit different over here. So when we talk about assignments, we can talk about replacing a research essay with a Wikipedia assignment, right? You can do this. You can be like Amin Azam at the University of California Medical School, where his students, who are future GPs in many cases, he thought about, my students will have to explain complex medical concepts in lay terms to somebody who walks into their walk-in clinic in a couple of minutes. This is actually a great way for them to practice, write articles about this in lay language in Wikipedia. And they've been doing this for years. There's a lot of that kind of project. You could replace an oral presentation instead of assassinating the entire class very slowly. Move them, have them create digital learning resources, openly license them. Here are a couple of students from Simon Fraser University down the road from me in BC. They submitted their video to an international student video competition. They won $6,000, it looks like, which is, 45,000 Canadian today. But the point is, their video is now being used to teach the science of persuasion by faculty members across the world. It's openly licensed. That's the power of this, right? You can have students annotate open resources that you're adopting. What you're seeing on the right is the open source digital annotation tool called Hypothesis, where on the top, one of my students in my social psychology course is augmenting the example in the text with an example from her lived experience to provide another, richer example for students. And the bottom, another student, Alexa, is sharing a resource, an example from popular culture at the time to illustrate another concept, right? Again, as faculty members, you don't have to reach, you don't have to figure out what makes sense to students today now that I can't use, my Seinfeld references or whatever it is. Let them do it. They are much better positioned to do it. They can and they will do it, right? So you can do that. You can have students annotate OER. You can have students author OER. Students at the Ohio State University writing bite-sized chunks over here about environmental science. The volume edited by the faculty members in the program. This is written by students. It's an open textbook. Here's another example. This comes from my former institution. This one is a little bit close to home because this is one of my closest collaborators and friends who sadly passed just under a year ago. Some of you may know her work. Her name is Arlie Crothers, Arlie McNeely. worked with her on this. She taught applied communications. She designed a research project where the students got some agency. They picked the topic. They chose textbook affordability. Surprise, surprise. I mean, Arlie and I were in there a lot, so that was going to happen. They interviewed students across the campus, did survey research, did qualitative interviews. They generated a report. On the basis of the report, the students, as part of their course assignment, designed a tabletop board game having to do with textbook affordability. It was super cool. I mean, it was almost like, Monopoly in a way, where you had almost the equivalent of chance cards, random life events that happened to you along the way based on real students' lived experiences. But you had to navigate this journey as a student, perspective taking about, here's my decision about which books I'm going to buy, which books I'm going to read, which one I can't afford that, I'm going to drop that course. It's incredible. Of course, later on, we adapted it. We put it on the web as an interactive branching scenario using a technology called H5P. So you can actually play with this now. It's a nice faculty development tool. But I'll give you a snapshot of this over here. Beautiful, beautiful project, deeply meaningful and influential over here. But the students had the agency, the students had the voice. It was one of the most beautiful projects I've ever come across. And certainly with, from one of the most beautiful faculty members I've ever had the privilege of working with. So as I say this, and I try and control my emotions over here, I'll also point out that you may be gleaning from what I'm talking about, that with open pedagogy, we're not just talking about open licensing, which is useful, important, but also somewhat antiseptic. It's not that, it doesn't move my heart, open licensing, let me put it that way. Here's what moves my heart, critical pedagogy. And for me, open pedagogy draws on both in equal parts. Open licensing on the one hand, and OER, and what we can do with that, but also critical pedagogy. And so this is where we think about how students can engage their own learning from a position of agency, right? Think about how we can co-create course policies with students, schedules of work with students, choose the topics that we're covering with students, involve them in co-creating knowledge as part of their assignments. It's a radical transformation from the banking concept of education. And so this approach takes seriously the educational imperative to encourage students to act on the knowledge, values, social relations they acquire by being responsive to the deepest and most important problems of our times. Now, when we were thinking about this at my former institution, one of the things we ended up doing was building an open pedagogy fellowship for our faculty members. It was interdisciplinary, international, interinstitutional. Faculty members in small groups from 3 different institutions worked together and designed not a disposable assignment, but a renewable assignment, one that follows these principles. And they aligned with different sustainable development goals from the United Nations. So one of my favorite ones, you're seeing a bit of material from that at the bottom. Faculty members from 3 different disciplines, as you can see, 2 different institutions. They focused on food insecurity on the local campuses. Students worked on a project mapping out all of the edible weeds on the campus grounds of the different institutions. Scientific quality database, beautiful project, right? And so I'm going to try, if this works, and share a brief video clip with you of one of these amazing faculty members involved in this, because Jen Hardwick from the English department at KPU can say this much better than I can. Let's see.
Because I've been using open pedagogy in my classes for the last 5 or 6 years, and I've used renewable assignments before and media assignments before, and I think they're very effective. I think they allow a kind of creativity and engagement that a lot of other assignments don't. And I am a writing instructor primarily. I'm interested in good communication, and I think that communication should extend in the digital age to different kinds of assignments, different ways of employing rhetoric and self-expression. And so this is a good opportunity to encourage students to think about those skills. I'm also interested in using open pedagogy because I want students to think deeply about it, and I want them to think about access to information and the ethics that guide that. Both the ethics of what we see now in education in terms of the high costs of textbooks and the inaccessibility of a lot of resources, but also on the other end, the way that the academy has been complicit in extracting knowledge and in monetizing knowledge that doesn't necessarily belong to the people who are doing the extracting. And so I want students thinking carefully about the information that they gather and the information that they share, and how to do that in ethical ways. And I think that open assignments are a great way to introduce those conversations.
Jen's amazing, and I do apologize. I should have thought to activate those captions at the start. I will make sure I do that in the future. But moving on from here, I will say that one of the things, are you working, maybe? No? There we go. One of the things we can do, thank you, Erica, and this is awkward with the wiring, so I'm going to traipse out. One of the things you can do in your practice is, I'll talk about 3 dimensions. I think there's many things you can shift, but generally speaking, I think you can move from more teacher-centric processes, to more learner-centric processes, right? You can also move from aspects that are more content-centric to more process-centric. You can move from things that are primarily about pedagogical value to things that are primarily about social justice. There's lots of design decisions over here. As you're looking for inspiration, I'll point you to a couple of different places. This is one. This is the Open Pedagogy Notebook that my colleague Robin DeRosa from Plymouth State University, New Hampshire, and I created several years ago. It was meant to serve as a place where faculty members could browse, get examples. What does open pedagogy look like in practice at the assignment level, at the course level, at the course policy level, whatever. And of course, we did this as much as we could. Lots of submissions came in from the community, and eventually both of us moved into administrative roles and ran out of time. And so I'm very happy to say that recently, this has come up. The Open Education Network has an open pedagogy portal that builds on our work, and now we are redirecting over there. But it's a beautiful space for community. So if you're looking to learn, especially within your discipline, get a sense of what could I do? What could I build on? Oh, that sounds great. I'm going to tweak that, build on that. I recommend that you visit both of those. And as I said, all of these slides will be shared publicly or emailed out to whoever registered, or some vague promise that I'm not going to follow through on myself, but I'm imposing on other people to follow through on. Erica's smiling, so hopefully that's okay. So yeah, but let's go just a little bit deeper, So in recent years, this conversation has been getting more and more critical. And I will say this because even within open education, you can imagine, I've heard enough of the sort of neo-colonial message in the subtext around, well, let's save the masses, let the knowledge trickle down to the unwashed. I hear that sometimes, and it's deeply disturbing to me. It happens especially when the voices advancing that kind of message are quite distant from experiences of marginalization. That has changed a lot. There's a lot of folks working in open education now, a lot of open textbook authors who come from less than privileged backgrounds, which is fantastic. And so one of the things we try and do, so Maha Bali, who I work with, she's at the American University of Cairo. Catherine Cronin is another friend. She works in Ireland over there. We've been talking about how you can engage in open pedagogy in a way that's actually harmful, right? So if you think about the disproportionate risk borne by students of color if they're editing Wikipedia and how they are targeted in flame wars, for example, right? The risks of open scholarship are not evenly distributed, is a premise of that argument. But that's just one example. If you mandate that students perform public scholarship without giving them choice, without giving them agency, that's exploitation. So at UFM, like many other places, students own the intellectual property for their coursework. It needs to be their choice if they perform public scholarship. It needs to be their choice if they're going to apply an open license. You can help them with that, but it's their call, right? So you can do harm with the best of intentions. In many cases, when we do open pedagogy, we are having a positive effect. Don't get me wrong, it's very, very wonderful. But it's typically ameliorative. So, we're doing things by, we're creating OER with students, freeing up the cost burden, talking about changing things in terms of knowledge structures, absolutely. But we can often go a bit beyond as well. We can get to a place where things are truly transformative. And that's where we really, again, empower those who do not enjoy sufficient privilege within the academy. And we design for them in mind, not accommodating them, but designing for them. So there's, again, intent and design justice that you can sort of bake into it. I'm sharing this because, this is similar to the idea that you can adopt an open textbook that's free for students, but you don't have to change a thing about your teaching and learning practice, right? You can treat it like a book from Pearson, right? And if it's a print book, it'll look, smell, and taste like a Pearson book, except for the bitter aftertaste, right? But the same is true with open pedagogy. You can do this in a way that's engaging for students, but that doesn't intentionally address justice. And that's what we're talking about, is we can go further over here. And particularly when it's the kind of project that I showcased with Arlie McNeely's project, that really centered the voices, the lived experiences of the most marginalized students within that beautiful open pedagogy project that is now used to help faculty members understand the experience of marginalized students in order to reshape their decision-making around course materials. So you can see the deeper layers of a project like that, for example. And so when I talk about this kind of work, I'm always reminded of the incredible words of obviously one of my favorite authors, no surprise, Arundhati Roy, who said, there's really no such thing as the voiceless, right? There's really only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. And within the academy, we have a lot of that, of course. So coming through the pandemic, and now, it's not like we're past the pandemic. There are people falling sick with COVID every day still. But coming through the earlier phases of the pandemic, I think one of the things many of us felt was, there were gains we made, particularly around accessibility, right? And you know this as well as I do. Suddenly, people were being accommodated with, sure, we can do that online. Absolutely, we can record this, and why not? Let's move to digital that, and does anybody? Yes, okay, we'll do that. All of a sudden, right, the things that everybody said, no, there's no way, absolutely. And now we're seeing that regression, right? It's really fascinating to see how, for me, what used to be pre-pandemic ableist laptop bans in the classroom quickly became ableist camera on policies on the laptops. It's really fascinating to me, right? Because it's not about the laptops. It was always about the control. And so for me, this is the opportunity we have, is to think about what we have gained through the pandemic, how we can center questions about accessibility, for example, about inclusion, about belongingness, right? We have that opportunity right now. I think many of us know that we were in the same storm, but we were not in the same boat. Many of us were in very, very different boats, right? So we can talk about how we rebuild higher education in the future. I would argue certainly in a way that humanizes learning, that recognizes that pedagogy and technology are deeply entangled, right? I would argue that we need a more critical, a more inclusive, a more open approach, one that leads with trust of students and trust of faculty, right? And if I'm going to draw on a wonderful insight from a scholar, her name is Christina Katapodis, if we're going to talk about rigor, because that's a fun word that's been weaponized over the last few years, I always think about rigor mortis effectively, right? Because rigor gets operationalized as inflexibility. So rigor mortis works for me, right? Like, no, you shall not have an extension. Yes, you must have your camera on. Yes, I will need a death certificate of the person who passed away in your family. It's incredible what we've done with rigor. And so I'd rather talk about rigor in terms of instructional design. If we're going to talk about academic integrity, let's talk about the integrity of actually designing engaging effective, equitable learning environments and experiences, not just about student misconduct, for example, which of course is going to happen. But let's lead with care, but not forget self-care. Let's build supports that support humans and that make humanity a little more possible. I'll finish with a couple of quotes over here. One is from a beautiful book. If you're unfamiliar with this, Kevin Gannon is an amazing person. He's a friend, he's a scholar, he's a historian. He goes by that tattooed prof, by the way. But in his book, Radical Hope, a teaching manifesto, he writes that the real work of change in higher education is done students by students, classroom by classroom, course by course. And it's done by educators who've committed to teaching because it and their students matter. I agree with that. And this, for me, again, calls to mind, I started with bell hooks, or maybe finish with bell hooks, who wrote about how to teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential if we are to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin, right? Don't take this the wrong way, but some of our colleagues, every institution has this, right? The rhetoric we hear, and I get how difficult it is for faculty members, and our faculty members feel this way too. But if one has contempt for students, I'm thinking the classroom is not the ideal place, right? I do think we need to also recognize how much of the broader environment that faculty are experiencing is a part of the experience they can deliver for students, right? But centering that humanity. I have this image lurking behind my title slide. I'm just going to pause just in case somebody's able to recognize the mountain range that's looking in the background. I'll give you a clue. It's from the southern hemisphere.
Is it lunar?
No. It's from Africa. The southern tip of Africa, actually. This is from Cape Town. Well, I'm lying. That's Cape Town in the background. Obviously, the picture is not taken from Cape Town, but that's Table Mountain in Cape Town. I'm sharing this with you because this is a photograph I took when I was visiting there some years ago, and where I'm standing is at the edge of Robben Island. Robben Island was initially a leper colony, and then it became a maximum security political prison for prisoners. And of course, among its most famous inmates was the former president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, who spent 18 years of a 27-year prison sentence on that island. If you are able to visit South Africa and Cape Town, I recommend you do so, soon. And I say this because it is still the case that the tour guides on Robben Island are mostly former inmates. And so the conversations we got to have that day about, daily small acts of resistance, how they maintained hope, especially when the injustice is so in front of you, is incredible. And for me, one of the reasons why I'm sharing this with you, because this for me is a treasured, memorable, life-changing educational experience for me, that visit. And so maybe along the same lines, I will say, in my mind, education at its finest is democratizing. It is liberatory. It is anti-racist. It is decolonizing. It is critical. It is inclusive. And in my mind, it is open.